Yeah, and so I'm actually working on a project at the university called TEVI. So I've got my initial slides up here. We're an European Regional Development funded project led by the University of Exeter, but also in partnership with the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, Cornwall Council and Cornwall Development Company, who look after our grant programme. So if there are any SMEs on this call, we do have a little bit of grant funding still available. And then my next slide. Our next slide was just a bit more explanation on kind of what TEVI does. So we're here to support SMEs, small and medium enterprises in Cornwall, and supporting business growth through two distinct pillars of sustainability, i.e. circular economy, but also nature's regeneration and nature's expansion, essentially, which we call environmental growth. And we're very good at opening the conversation between different people and really another channel into strategic plans like Cornwall Council's environmental growth strategy. And we've got various team members that can help people with those elements. But today I've been asked to talk about a report that myself and Chris wrote around this time last year, which involved TEVI, but also lots of different actors. We were this time led by the Environment and Sustainability Institute, and came together with the Council of the Isles of Scilly, Cornwall Council, and actually all the logos are down there at the bottom. And this was part of a strategic development fund, shared prosperity fund, I think it might have been, I can't remember now. But basically our aims and objective, as I've written up there, were to really identify, evaluate, and test locally relevant ideas that would reduce any negative impacts of the visitor economy on nature in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. So, but also generating understanding, funds and volunteer time to help protect that natural environment. So a lot of people obviously come down to Cornwall for the landscapes, for the wildlife that they perceive, and the beautiful formations of the beaches and things. Obviously, we're living next door to a lot of other ecosystems and animals and wildlife, so both the flora and the fauna. And we want to look at how we can come up with different synergies to help funnel maybe some of those funds and time from people visiting Cornwall for those reasons into protecting it as well. And then if I pass over to you, Chris, you could also maybe give a quick introduction as to who you are and talk through that procedure that we went through.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, Chris Gaskell. I'm also still at the University of Exeter working on a different project at the moment. But yeah, this I was looking at the Cornwall side of this report, and yeah, we had the same procedure in the most part as the Scilly side of the report. So we did an initial scoping of best practice from literature around the world into sustainable and regenerative tourism, but with a nature focus. After a few weeks of that, we had a stakeholder workshop to talk through some of the ideas we had and have a kind of a voting system to see which ones we should look at in further detail. And then we went on a slightly different path, talking to local stakeholders, doing interviews and surveys. And that process culminated in making recommendations for both Scilly and Cornwall of actions to take forward. Yeah.
There you go. And it was in, I would say, it was slightly different. Well, it was the same process essentially for Isles of Scilly as well. We basically split the group that had come together for this negative impact of tourism on the area and realised that Cornwall has some quite different issues to the Isles of Scilly, say, most notably the fact that the Isles of Scilly is basically an island community. So there's just the one avenue really to get to it from Cornwall, whereas Cornwall has lots of different routes that people can physically arrive here. Just as one of the many differences, just to focus on each one. Here we go. So yeah, we split it into the two different sections, and ultimately this is a little infographic that it's very much is a brief description of what we concluded. Sorry, I need to keep moving all out of the way. For the Cornwall side of things, maybe the three recommendations were nature encounters led by hospitality staff, who are very much on that front line of engaging with visitors, supporting local networks, and then also visitor gifting for nature's recovery, which Chris will go into a bit more detail about, because that's a pretty complex subject essentially. Whereas the other scene, we really thought that people need to understand the state of nature, that people are coming down here thinking that it's wonderful, everything's perfect, but just like the rest of the world, it's not perfect. So really getting an understanding of where they are as an island nation, or not quite nation, but an island community was really important. And also the idea of pledging respect. So that's when that different parts of traveling to get there could be kind of a boundary that could be introduced quite easily. And those charitable donations, again, was slightly different for the Isles of Scilly because of the way that they're set up. So we wrote 2 separate reports. This one is a bit more of an expansion on those recommendations for Cornwall. To start off with, nature education for hospitality staff. So people are coming down here, maybe they are taking themselves on self-guided walks, maybe they are paying for wildlife tours for boats to go out into the ocean. But lots of people maybe are just kind of, they haven't paid for those specific nature-based activities. And we found that some hoteliers in particular said that they'd be willing to put their staff on training courses so they could learn more about the natural environment around them and that the visitors would be encountering. So this could also help teach people informally about how best to react around wildlife. If they see a seal, not to rush up to it, but also it could teach people a bit more about the wildflowers. Some companies had already taught their staff to lead foraging walks and bits and pieces, but it seemed really quite a useful thing to people for campsites or hotels, various different elements of hospitality that are having these regular informal interactions, that it doesn't need a big campaign, a big advertising campaign, that we could really just get down to those frontline individuals that are talking to people to raise awareness of what needs to be protected, and how people that are coming down here from completely different environments, and it might just be very new to them, and they're just unaware that they're maybe doing any damage or disturbing anything that they see, that they kind of have come down here thinking it's all perfect and wonderful. And also the surveys that we undertook with visitors, a lot of them didn't realise that there was much of an issue down here in Cornwall or the Isles of Scilly. So that kind of education for hospitality staff we saw would be a really good recommendation for people. Do you want to carry on talking about the rest of those for Cornwall, Chris?
Yeah, sure thing. So yeah, in connection with that, there are various examples of local networks that have been set up over the years to kind of, feed in, get community buy-in and produce environmental goods or, nature enhancing aspects. Some of those have been groups that have been able to access revenue mechanisms. So there's an example of a local trust that controlled the car parking revenues and were able to channel that into beach cleaning and nature guiding. But though that permission to control the car park got taken away by the council, and so that all kind of went to pot. So there is definitely opportunities to support those networks that exist and re-establish them, but with an overall maybe institutional support from higher levels rather than seeking to control everything. Nature recovery, we're talking about regenerative tourism. Nature recovery is obviously a big part of that, given the biodiversity crisis as well as the climate emergency. We did a survey looking at how people kind of perceive nature in Cornwall, as Vicky touched on earlier. In general, people thought Cornwall was in a better state than the UK. That's for both locals and visitors, but still not in a good state. So there is, some recognition. And people were very keen to, among various options of supporting nature, was to take part in activities that would support nature. There was around 40% of people said they would be happy to pay something, but it was 70–80% to directly participate. And so what are those opportunities? Can they be developed? that's potential, an opportunity, an area to look at, and to develop nature recovery projects with local networks. It's a good combination. On the funding mechanisms, we did not explicitly look at tourism tax, and as been mentioned earlier, it's quite divisive, and it certainly did still come up in our conversations from people who had a view and wanted it to be expressed, which is fine. But we looked into other mechanisms of fundraising, and there were some good examples of visitor gifting, I think by some of the participants on this call actually, who they have tried different things in the booking process. So for example, if you're booking an accommodation, you might be spending hundreds or thousands of pounds, and if there is a little tick box that says, will you donate £10 or 1% or something to Cornwall Wildlife Trust, for example, that's a much less painful payment point than being asked explicitly to do that somewhere else. The interesting thing beyond that is how you actually incorporate that checkbox or that opt-in or opt-out. And there's a lot of research on this in other domains, but basically an opt-out is a much higher success rate, if we can term it like that, than an opt-in. And indeed, one of our interviews touched on that more broadly, and they switched from being opt-in to opt-out, and there was a massive increase in uptake and therefore revenue. So, we think there's real potential for this. Obviously, there'll be lots of different ways of booking, different kinds of websites. We should look at the research, look at the the implementation that's being done so far, look at the best practice, and encourage accommodation and activity providers to implement this. It's still going to be voluntary, but the potential for revenue raising and directing towards nature-based charities is pretty huge compared to the current revenue streams. So yeah, that was a key recommendation for us.
Okay, and then on the Isles of Scilly, which we decided to print as a separate report, this idea of a Scilly pledge. So a visitor pledge idea has actually been taken up by a few other island communities. The best well-known one is a country called Palau, where their immigration law actually makes it mandatory for people to sign the pledge in their passport. It's a stamp that they get when they enter the airport that says, I pledge. Well, it actually says, I pledge to the children of Palau to protect the country that you live in, to not damage what's here, not take what's not given. And it's got a really, really beautiful video and advertising campaign with it as well, to tell people about the delicate ecosystems that they're coming across. So that was the most well-known one. It's also been taken up by New Zealand. Iceland had one that wasn't quite as well known, but also Hawaii's got one too that's obviously interesting with its volcanoes and magma that a lot of people aren't used to. But it's just a really lovely way of, because they're quite poetic, it's basically advertising how beautiful this place is and what we celebrate and like about it, and in a very gentle and kind way, remind people that this is here to be protected and everything we love about it might not be here in future if you don't respect it. And this one also, the steamship company that is that transport route for most people to get into the Isles of Scilly, so they'd absolutely love that, to be on the boat. And this one is essentially still in progress with the Isles of Scilly Wildlife Trust, who really want to lead on that and make sure it's got the right information in there about those species in particular that need protecting. And also it needs to have support from the community, which we did a survey as part of this report, and people seemed to be in agreement that it was a nice idea, a gentle way of telling people without reprimanding them, because most people aren't trying to misbehave, but this just kind of maybe nudged perspectives. And then also the report of the state of nature on the Isles of Scilly, because it only covers a few kilometres in itself, really the granularity of what the data that's available at the moment kind of groups the Isles of Scilly maybe together as just one clump, but really there needs to be more detail of what's actually happening on the ground, because it's a very unique environment where it is out in the sea, and all of the different migratory birds and things that come past. So an understanding of where we are now and what needs to be protected was another recommendation, which is already also being acted upon. And then those raising charitable donations, that visitor gifting idea is potentially a little more simplified in the Isles of Scilly because of the Isles of Scilly Friends of Scilly wildlife scheme, that there's a very obvious charity to protect a very specific area of the UK, i.e. the Isles of Scilly, whereas potentially that visitor gifting concept in Cornwall, for nature anyway, has lots of different charities that it could be using to support. And again, the steamship company already has this as an option when you buy tickets to travel over to the Isles of Scilly. I understand now they've also gone with a nature-based one, but also a charity for the local community, for kind of a human-based charity too, which is brilliant. And that just option there, when people buy their tickets, as we've said, they're already paying for something else. So it's a fairly painless area. So actually I could put a little bit more as well to protecting the beautiful destination that I'm going to. There you go. Would you like to carry on with this one, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So as part of our kind of initial scoping research, we looked at different tourism concepts, and although the project was called Sustaining the Visitor Economy Environment, it's very much that's the kind of the minimum. We've got to be looking at regeneration as well, especially given the various crises or emergencies that we're looking at. And this is not something that's new. It's been implemented around the world in different respects. We looked at New Zealand and Costa Rica, and what kind of lessons could be applied in local context. But yeah, we very much asked, did the surveys and asked questions around considering this and what do we need to do to regenerate rather than just sustain. So there are various schemes or various case studies that we can look at that have are looking in this vein and could be supported in regenerative activities. So there are some mentioned down there. I've touched on Watergate Bay already. The WISE scheme is about marine wildlife and minimizing disturbance. That's a voluntary scheme, but it's encouraging operators to really consider the best way to engage or not engage with wildlife. Obviously Coast, which Amanda will probably talk about later, is a pioneer in this area, not just sustainability, but with being more progressive. And I think Malcolm touched on regenerative tourism earlier as well. So it's definitely on the radar. And it's the way that things need to be thought about, but with a real commitment rather than pledges as such. So yeah, there's a lot more information about that out there, and yeah, we think maybe a reframing of sustainability to regeneration is a good idea.
So here are some other examples of basically where funding has made it in different areas in Cornwall. I'm not sure how many people are aware that after the G7 was hosted here last year, there was some money made available for this specific area in this map diagram there. So it kind of stretches across from the Luxillian Valley, includes all of the Gosmore area, and down there, as you can see, towards the Roseland, there was an area drawn out for more investment, and specifically in nature's regeneration, but growth and expansion again. So this is a picture of a boardwalk that I recently helped install at Woodland Valley Farm that people might be aware of. That's when a couple of beavers were introduced a few years ago, and most of the time it's really, really muddy and fairly inaccessible, particularly for anybody with any kind of usual accessibility issues. So this G7 funding was used to help buy these materials, and then a team of 12 volunteers have built this amazing boardwalk so that people in wheelchairs have access to this nature-based activity. Chris Jones, the owner of the site and the farmer whose land it's on, has regular evening sessions. Essentially, people come along, learn about the beavers, why they need to be protected, why they've been put in place, and the impact that's had on the biodiversity in this area and in other areas in Cornwall now. And so it's that easy win, nature-based activity to educate people about protecting it, which is quite exciting. And there are other projects as well that have applied for this funding. So we'll hear about another time. So this one is then a project that I'm on. Tevi has actually helped the Isles of Scilly fund some live streaming. They're not actually online yet, they are shortly online. These were just installed this year in between the breeding seasons. So it was quite an adventure to be installing these remote cameras and all the power systems and getting them out there to monitor seals and a couple of different bird nesting sites. And the sealed one in particular is on an uninhabited island, and people aren't supposed to land there. And it's also not somewhere that people aren't supposed to, people cannot land there. And it's also somewhere that's not kind of a regular kind of thoroughfare. So it'll be really brilliant to have these cameras monitoring all the time, and for people to be sat remotely having a look at what's going on and how they're doing, whether they're disturbed or not disturbed, if they're thriving. And they're also looking at the red squirrels on Tresco, which was a slightly simpler one, because the red squirrels in Tresco Abbey Gardens have got some feeding tables, so they can be pointed at those. And then the Manx shearwater is actually, we've funded bird boxes that will have cameras in them that will also be able to keep an eye on these birds without disturbing them. So that's all very exciting in terms of that monitoring and working out the state of nature. And then another little plug for Tevi is that I've organised an event on the 28th of April over in Laddock, looking really at that G7 catchment area that I pointed out there, and really encouraging SMEs from that area to come along. And it's kind of going to be a bit of a showcase of what else there is in those parts of Cornwall that do so often get forgotten about, that people think Cornwall's all about the beaches and the coastal areas, but actually we've got an awful lot of heritage and beautiful rural environments, the moors and things that people can come along to as well. So hopefully you can come along to that, everybody on this call. And also that little pine and hedgehog picture down there is something else that the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, as a partner on Tevi's, been working with over the last few months, kind of essentially talking to, and then a little bit of a brochure for pubs and pub gardens. It's had a really amazing uptake, just these little areas that we can improve for biodiversity, both for flora and fauna. So we're hoping to extend that a bit more for any places like campsites or hotels that might have outside space and just want to do that little bit with the area that they have. So kind of combining those two together with that event, and a bit more about that on the day. So thank you very much.